think.
Hello, everyone. I'm Daz, and welcome to American Civil War and UK History podcast. This presentation is available as a video on YouTube and as a podcast from wherever you get your podcast from. And we're also on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And most recently, I joined TikTok, so I took the plunge up with the kids. Yeah, so the Unfiltered Historian team as well, and part of them. So you will find all the links below in the description via Linktree. So joining me today is Mark Turnbull. And Mark is a historian and an author of a series of English Civil War books, which we will discuss at the end. But today we are going to be discussing a very important event in British history, and that is the trial and execution of King Charles I. So firstly, welcome, Mark.
Hiya, Darren.
So could you please give us a quick overview of the British Civil Wars, please, to paint the picture?
Yes. So that's a big, where do I start really? But I'll try and put it into a potted history for you. So the road to war itself was a long one. The catalyst, I think, was Ireland, which erupts in 1641 with a Catholic rebellion. So the issue is that the army that's needed to restore order is legally controlled by the king, and Parliament naturally fear that. So England breaks into civil war from early 1642. So again, generalizing, Charles is strongest in the north, Wales, the southwest, Parliament in the east, London and southeast. The Midlands is much more fluid. That's fought over quite a lot. Charles, I think, loses a lot of opportunities. He is too idealistic, lacks the ruthlessness. For example, he refuses to let his generals attack London when he has the chance. He doesn't believe in victory by such a conquest. He's sending his own doctor to the bedside of one of his greatest enemies. He's refusing to storm Gloucester in 1643 because he's haunted by the losses incurred at Bristol. But by 1643, the Royalists look to be in the ascendancy, nevertheless, and his nephew, Prince Rupert, is undefeated. The biggest change comes in January 1644, and that is when Scotland enters the war. So after Parliament reach out and make an agreement that involves establishing Presbyterianism in England, the Scots join in an alliance. So Charles, for his part, is trying to bring over English troops back from Ireland to support his cause. But as the Scots take the north, gradually the weight of numbers, the loss of wealth, loss of fortresses, towns, resources, that all begins to tell. There's one glimmer of hope in this late stage, and that is, despite the setbacks in England, there's the spectacular Marquis of Montrose and Alasdair MacCulloch. They take Scotland briefly for the king in August 1645. But with Montrose's defeat in September, that's it. It's a slippery slope to military defeat, and Charles has few choices left as Oxford, his headquarters, is encircled. He can either surrender to Parliament's new model army, to the Scottish army. He can flee the country altogether, so Denmark and France are options, or he can attempt to go to London, believe it or not, and this was seriously considered, to appear in London in person to negotiate with Parliament in the hope that that might broker a good deal. So Charles rides out of Oxford in the early hours of April 1646. He's dressed as a servant. He's had his hair and beard cut. He's only got two companions. Governor shouts behind him, "Farewell, Harry." That's his code name. And they head to London, but then they turn as if in slightly somewhat confusion, uncertain about whether to go to London in actual fact or whether to turn north and go to the Scots. There's also the port of King's Lynn that could take him to Scotland itself or one of those other countries. They end up trying to cut each other's hair with knives, burning papers, arouse a lot of suspicion. And in the end, he chooses the Scots. So the reason he chooses the Scots, outside of Newark, is because France has been trying to broker a deal with Scotland on the king's behalf. They've been trying to, well, nobody least of all France wants to see a victorious, strong Puritan Parliament. So yeah, France tried to broker a deal with the king and the Scots. The Scots, for their part, seem to encourage this, and as soon as Charles arrives at the Scottish HQ, a lot of what he understood is reneged upon. So he's left in a bit of a position.
Okay, so yeah, it's the first time I've heard about him actually thinking about going to London. So what was the idea behind that? Was he going to try and broker some kind of a deal with the Parliament?
Yeah, I think the thing that was in his mind, I think, was that if he actually turned up, that potentially would bring a lot of moderates to his side, and he did have a lot of moderate support. So yeah, I think he was probably banking on his presence actually turning the tide and managing to convince people that he had returned to London and his Parliament. I mean, that throughout the war, there was a lot of calls by Parliament and by the City of London itself that the king should return to his Parliament, you know, as if he'd abandoned them and left. So yeah, by doing that, it's almost sort of calling the bluff of those leaders. I mean, the Queen was dead against it. You know, the Queen said you should not go back to London at all unless you're at the head of an army. So yeah.
Okay, so he goes up to Scotland. So please explain how he ends up in the hands of Parliament, because he does in the end, doesn't he?
Yeah, well, so in a nutshell, so he actually goes to Newark, and the Scots are currently besieging Newark at that time in April 46. So the king surrenders to the Scottish army, obviously thinking that he's going to get the best deal from the Scots. The Scots themselves, once they have the king, and eventually, you know, Charles orders, as a sign of good faith, he orders a lot of his remaining fortresses to surrender, including Newark. And the Scots then withdraw north to Newcastle with the king. And at that point, that's when there's a bit of a situation, you know, obviously Parliament are a bit wary of the fact that the Scots have the king, you know, a bit of a trump card. And then, to cut a long story short, so they do a deal, they pay the Scots off. They don't necessarily pay for the king, they pay the Scots off for their support and say, well, the war's over now, you know, you can go back to Scotland, give us the king. And the Scots do that. So £400,000 in total, paid in installments, and the Scots gradually withdraw, and the king is taken into parliamentary custody. So that there's commissioners from Parliament that take him into custody, and then eventually, so he never makes it to London because the army move in. So you then have the parliamentarian side as such splitting down the middle into what you call independents and Presbyterians, and it's the Presbyterians are the ones that are still more in favour with the Scots and with the Royalists. You know, they're looking for a bit of a restoration of Charles. You know, that's their goal still, whereas the independents are a little bit more hardline. You know, not necessarily wanting just a continuation of what was currently there.
So the army take charge of Charles then, basically, and then so where's Cromwell stand in the middle of all this?
Well, that's a question and a half, to be honest, because a lot of the time nobody knows where Cromwell stands. I think he's covered his tracks very well through the Civil War. A lot of the time Cromwell's in the shadows. His views have not been committed to paper, or not survived at least. There's other people doing that sort of work for him. I mean, there's no doubt at all that Cromwell was involved. What we won't know unless some document surfaces as how much. But certainly the people around Cromwell, you know, were pushing for the army to sort of get the king, and then that backs up the independent cause a little bit, because, you know, both Parliament in itself started to sort of withdraw into some infighting, really. You know,
Mhm.
now that the war's at an end, what do we do? What is the outcome that everybody wants? Yeah, so they end up
So
disputing.
what is their agenda though by grabbing the king, the army? Have they got an agenda behind that? They just want to push
Yeah,
their views across, or
yeah. I mean, there's the agenda, the political side of things, where one side wants a more radical approach to a peace, you know, and a settlement. The other wants a more traditional approach. You know, the king had already given up quite a few of his prerogative powers in 1641 before the war. The remaining, the key remaining powers that they want from him is the control of the militia, and then reform of the church. So I think both sides want to use the king, and even the Scots as well. You know, even though the Scots have withdrawn here, you know, they still harbour the desire to have Presbyterianism established in England. You know, which through whichever means possible, whether that's a deal with the king, you know. So the king is kind of in the center of all of this, and he knows that as well. You know, so he's playing them off, they're playing him off.
yeah.
Um,
So he is obviously taken captive and he's held at Hampton Court. So tell us a little bit about his time at Hampton Court, please.
yeah, well, so Hampton Court, I think, in the scheme of what was to come, he was dealt fairly well by the army. So, you know, at the point when he does escape Hampton Court, he actually writes a letter to thank the commander for how he's dealt with him. But nevertheless, I think for the king, the fact that he's held at Hampton Court by the army, there's that element of duress, you know, so the king is conscious that he is under guard. So anything, you know, that potentially is agreed could carry that clause that it wasn't freely given. So the king obviously is reacting against this at the time as well. You've got the Putney debates going on. So by that time, the New Model Army had severely divided. So Parliament, on the one hand, were approaching the king. They were the legal representatives of the country, proposing peace terms to the king. You also had the New Model Army themselves who were proposing their own terms. So no sort of legal basis there, but they were proposing their own terms, which were a lot more favourable than Parliament's. And then the Scots as well were in constant touch with Charles. Again, that sort of vying for a victorious peace, if you like. You know, the war is over, but now it's the war for the peace of the kingdom. So yeah, so Charles, you know, has he visits his children for the first time. So we see some of his children that were held in London for most of the war. They stay with him at Hampton Court. You know, there's an incident where he complains to the governor of Hampton Court, Edward Whaley, about the soldiers outside the bedroom keeping his daughter awake and you know, asking for them to be withdrawn. You know, so all in all, it wasn't a bad time. However, outside of that bubble, as I said, the New Model Army are almost imploding. So in London, the Putney debates, this is where the Levellers, who want universal male suffrage, they want the abolition of the House of Lords. You know, some sections of them want the king to be put on trial. You've got those elements who are putting forward these options to the army high command. So Fairfax, Cromwell, Ireton. The army high command don't want to entertain that. And this is probably one of the myths about the Civil War, that Parliament, that Parliament cause fought for democracy. They didn't. Nobody was fighting for democracy there, bar the Levellers. And the Levellers were very much part of Parliament. So they weren't fighting for that democracy. They were just pushing it as much as they possibly could in manifestos. So Fairfax, Cromwell, Ireton didn't want universal male suffrage. They firmly believed that only men with property, a certain value of property, should have a say in government. And the Levellers were going up against that, and really quite successfully, to the point where they did have the army leaders around a table to talk about, what they wanted the end settlement to be. The curious thing with Charles at Hampton Court is that Edward Whalley presents Charles with a letter from Cromwell, and the letter makes reference to threats to Charles's life, and whether that was deliberately done, Cromwell penning that letter and then Whalley showing that to the king, you can speculate, but certainly what happened at that point was that Charles started to get a little bit concerned about his own safety, possibly looked for a reason to escape this army confinement, and escaped from Hampton Court. For the Putney debates and for the army leaders, this was great news, because immediately those debates about the future and the peace and the settlement of the kingdom were brought to an end. So all of the troublesome levellers were brought back into the fold, because they had to then join and fight against that common threat, which is that the king was on the loose and what would happen. So it was very, very opportunist for the army grandees.
Mm-hmm. So, like you said, he escapes and he ends up in the Isle of Wight, or on the Isle of Wight, sorry. I just want to go back for a second there. So basically, because you've explained it so well, they fought this war, and actual fact, they didn't know what they wanted at the end of it, did they? Really, they just sort of they're making it up as they go along. They don't know what they want to do they? Really, they've won the war and they don't actually really know what they want to do.
I think things changed as it went along. I think what they perhaps thought might be the outcome at the start, as the years went by, I think people realized that couldn't be the outcome any longer, and I think something that's often overlooked here is that both sides, so we talk about divine right, and that Charles, was stubborn and thought that he should be the one to govern the country, and he was answerable to nobody but God. But at the same time, there's a fine line between divine right, in my opinion, and the parliamentarian leaders, who were equally stubborn in their beliefs, and equally firm that God was on their side, and believed and supported what they wanted, So you've got both sides that really can't back down.
So he does escape again. Sorry, we'll go back to that. So how does he escape? Because he's got this free reign, hasn't he, at Hampton Court? So it's made quite easy for him, from the way I understand it.
Well, yeah, and that's another thing about why I do feel that there was more to his escape than meets the eye, because so the king, so basically what he does, he spends quite a lot of time writing letters before his evening meal, and this particular evening, and when the king does withdraw into that inner chamber to write the letters, nobody disturbs him, and his servants don't follow him in there. And the governor, initially, when the king doesn't turn up, isn't particularly perturbed by that. It's only as time presses on that he goes to the king's rooms and asks for the door to be opened. The servants, kind of push back and say, no, you can't possibly do that. You can't disturb the king. And the governor is content, as the hours go by, to just wait without any sign that the king is inside, no noise. And it's several hours before he orders the door to be opened, conveniently. And by that time, the king is long gone, to find the king's greyhound in the corner whimpering, and no king. But there is a letter there for the governor, as I say, thanking him for his kindness.
So it's such an interesting story. It really is. So he ends up down in or on the south coast of England. He ends up going to the Isle of Wight. What is his plan when he gets to the Isle of Wight?
Well, I think this is where the king hasn't got a plan. So they're still not sure why on earth he ends up going to the Isle of Wight. So I think Charles, so he goes to the house of a supporter, probably to make a decision on where he's going to go. And one of his closest supporters, one of those men who had left, one of the two men that had left Oxford with him back in 1646, he turns up and says, "Oh, I've brought somebody here. It's Robert Hammond, the governor of the Isle of Wight. He'll be a supportive, I'm sure, and perhaps the Isle of Wight's a good place." And I'm not sure who was more surprised, Charles or Hammond. So Hammond really was quite shocked to realise that the king was here. The king who'd escaped had come to him, and the king was equally upset by the prospect as well. So he said to Jack Ashburnham, who had brought Hammond, "Oh, Jack, thou hast undone me." And there was no going back. So I think both parties knew, the king knew that now that his whereabouts were discovered, he'd have to go over to the Isle of Wight. Hammond, as reluctantly as he was to have the king in his custody, couldn't do anything more but agree. And again, the other aspect to this is, for the army leaders, the Isle of Wight was the best possible choice for them. So if they, for the army, having possession of Charles opened up a bit of an embarrassment when Charles wasn't accepting their proposals. So it left them with control of the king and then an increasingly divided army under their command. To have the king out of their hair was much better, but to have him on the Isle of Wight, where he could be easily held, and monitored, was perfect. He wasn't at large in the country itself.
Okay, so he was obviously in prison, and again, this guy's in an awkward position because he's a Parliament supporter, isn't he? So he can't now turn around and let Charles slip away, because he would be to blame, wouldn't he?
That's right. Yeah. And Robert Hammond, pleaded with Parliament many times to say, let me give up this charge. I don't want this responsibility. And every time he was told no.
Mm-hmm. So, okay, he's put into custody in a castle that's on the Isle of Wight called Carys Brook Castle. Tell us about his time there.
Yeah. Excuse me.
That's right.
Yeah, so Carys Brook, I don't think it's a particularly appealing place for Charles. I mean, they do build a bowling green for him, and eventually, he gets visits from a certain Jane Warwood, who, according to a letter that was unearthed some years ago, appears to have been quite intimate with the king. But in Carys Brook, that's where he attempts to make the best of a situation. He attempts to spin out time. He still has significant support, despite the military defeat in the war. He knows Hammond, so Hammond isn't a stranger. So Hammond's relatives, you've got one of them who is an officer in the New Model Army, the other who is Charles's chaplain. So he does know Hammond. The Scots themselves begin to realise that that Parliament and the New Model Army are starting to get a little bit more militant, more under the control of that independent faction. And they start to approach the king at Carys Brook with an out-and-out offer to support his restoration to the throne. So as I say, the king now has 3 factions approaching him. I think many Puritans had never been keen on adopting Scottish Presbyterianism anyway. So it's at Carys Brook that a group of Scots called the Engagers approach Charles and offer that military support. A deal is signed So Charles agrees with them. The document that he signs is sealed in lead and buried at Carisbrooke. And that, I think, is, again, another turning point. So that's the 26th of December, 1647. I think that was a big mistake in a way, because that opened up a second war.
Yeah, so that starts the Second Civil War then, basically, doesn't it? Because the English Civil Wars, or the British Civil Wars, as I like to call it now, because that's what it is three wars, isn't it? It's, you know.
That's it, yeah, War of the Three Kingdoms, yeah, that's it.
So,
and it's from that moment that label, Man of Blood, that's when it frequently gets attached, because primarily that's Second Civil War.
And this really annoys and upsets Parliament at this stage, and the army, the new model army.
Yes, yeah, it does. I mean, I think it upsets the army more, because the army, the Parliament themselves are predominantly controlled by the Presbyterians, and again, these are the people who would happily see an accommodation with Charles. Not to sell out their principles. They still have the militia and the church that they want to reform, but they will be more likely to see a more of a traditional outcome than the New Model Army, for example.
So while he is at Carisbrooke, I understand there is another attempt to escape, and this is actually quite a funny story. Not for Charles, obviously. Could you tell us a little bit about this?
Yes. So I think, to be honest, I think Carisbrooke, it's a bit of an embarrassing situation for the king. I mean, he's, the divinely appointed king of three kingdoms, and he does end up playing cat and mouse with Robert Hammond. He's brought to that point where even just smuggling letters out is a small victory. So there are several escape attempts, as you say. The first one, ships are secured, they're laid offshore. There's acid procured from London to burn through the bars of his window. So it all seems set. Everybody's in place, but the king doesn't go through with it. So for some reason, he doesn't actually leave the castle, and he decides against making a move. The second attempt, he actually gets stuck in the window. So his body gets stuck in the window, and the person that's waiting for him below, he is the groan that the king's stuck, and he goes back into the room, and then that's it. I think the king firmly has enough now of escape attempts. There's a point where Hammond actually gets into the king's room when the king is, supposedly handling some sensitive documents. So the king tries to throw them in the fire. Hammond scrabbles to try and get them. There's a bit of a kerfuffle. Hammond says dryly, I wasn't aware your majesty was leaving us. But yeah, at that point, that's when the king thought no more escape attempts. And it was a very conscious change in his attitude. It was almost as if he realized that he isn't going to escape. Perhaps he thought that God seems to have in mind a trial of faith and constancy, and the king should stay whatever happens. And he does accept that. Come what may, his destiny now was to stand firm for those red line principles that he has. Because I think the other thing as well for Charles is that there were certain principles that he never bargained with or used or manipulated. So he even said this to Parliament when the army, or just before the army took him into custody. He could agree to anything that they want and then just go back on it and say it was duress. But there were certain, as I say, red lines that he never actually compromised for anything. And at Carisbrooke, and as this change in his manner took precedence, talking about November 1648, he actually pushes the boundaries and almost comes to an agreement with Parliament. He actually makes concessions on those red line areas that he's never pushed so far before.
So can I just ask, this is probably a big what if. So say what if he does escape the Isle of Wight and he gets across to France. Does he then come back with armies, do you think, and try and take back the country? I mean, like you said, he's got the Scottish support. He could probably get the Irish support too. And he would probably have support from France, wouldn't he?
Yeah, well, the French, I mean, a little bit awkward. I don't think Charles fully trusted the French, and that might sound ironic because his wife, was French. But I think Charles knew, and certainly one of his letters to the Queen did show that he knew that the French had their own agenda as well. But I'm not actually sure if Charles seriously considered leaving the country. That was one of the aspects about Carisbrooke and the Isle of Wight, was that he would still be, in England, or in one of his kingdoms,
Yeah.
So I'm not sure that he would have ever left. I think for him, again, going back to London, when that opportunity early in the war presented itself, and his army could have swept down and took London by storm, he refused. He didn't want that sort of conquest, and I think leading a foreign army from a foreign country over, I don't think that would have appealed to him.
I agree, actually. Yeah. So this enough is enough now, isn't it? Parliament have had enough of Charles, and so when do the wheels start pushing for a trial and bringing him back to London?
So I'm not sure if Parliament do have enough of the king. It's true that they cut off all negotiations with him, but I think, as we see, they reopen that after a while. So, I mean, I'm not sure that they fully have enough. It's the army that have enough, definitely. The army step in. As I say, Charles is very close to making a treaty with the parliamentarian commissioners. He gives them a lot of, he pushes back his limits on some of those red line policies and principles. I think Parliament recognise that, and they vote to accept what he's given as the basis for negotiating a peaceful settlement. And it's at that point when the army realise that if this settlement goes ahead, then really there's going to be no room for any independents or Puritans or any sects. Levelers won't get a look in, their policies won't occur. So yeah, I think the army, and this is the thing with it, isn't it? The army, faceless. Who are the army? You know who Charles is. Charles personifies the entire royalist cause. But who are the Scots? Who are the army? Who are Parliament? It's a difficult one.
Yeah, what authority have they got? That's, I see what you're saying. Yeah. So the build up to the trial then. So he does get moved, doesn't he, back? I understand he stays a little while at Windsor, is it? And then gets moved to London. Is that correct?
Yeah, so initially, the army, so when Parliament nearly come to that agreement, the army move in, they exclude 186 MPs, a huge number from Parliament, and arrest 45 others, so that a large number excluded. Back in the days of 1642, the king was condemned for trying to arrest 5. Now you've got over 200 being excluded. And at that point, with Parliament now purged, the army, the army controlled Parliament. And then they take the king's person, seize the king's person, and take him to Hurst Castle. And it's at this point that Charles does believe that he's going to be murdered in secret. Hurst is just a tiny little fortress off the coast. It's very daunting, and as I say, he does think that he's going to be killed. And then gradually, they take him back to London, as you say, via Windsor.
So so the army are pushing for this. It's like a little bit of a military coup, really, isn't it? They can't agree. Again, there's all this infighting. They can't agree with each other what to do with the king. And obviously the army are pushing this, aren't they?
That's it. Yeah, it really is. It really is a coup. And And that's the thing, Charles would never be able to deal with the army because, if he ever did make an agreement with the army, but then making an agreement with the power of the sword over the laws, a lawful parliament, even a purged one, is a major issue.
So where does Fairfax stand in all this? Because he is head of the army, isn't he?
Yeah. So again, this is another good question. So Fairfax is a royalist at heart. It's a difficult one because Fairfax sort of straddles both sides of the opinion. So he does recognize that something has to change. The king has to back down. He needs to be defeated. But at the same time, he isn't out for a radical solution, as was proved in the Putney debates. Fairfax and Cromwell and Ireton put down the leveller cause. But Fairfax isn't, very good soldier, very good leader, but politically isn't very astute, or certainly isn't as astute as some of the leaders around him, his subordinates. I mean, certainly Cromwell is a lot more politically astute than Fairfax.
Yeah.
And I think that Cromwell actually says that as well. Or certainly there was a pamphlet published in 1649, not long, I think, before the king's execution, where Cromwell was supposed to have said that.
So Cromwell, again, is just standing in the background because he is in the art. So he's split, isn't he? Because he's, like you said, he's politically, he's in Parliament as well as being in the army, isn't he? So
yeah,
where does he actually stand with all this as well? Because, we always get the picture painted that Cromwell's the one that pushes all of this, Is he in the background, like winding it up?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen a letter from Cromwell to Fairfax around November 48, where Cromwell's the one urging Fairfax and saying, believe in God's will, open your heart, type of thing, do what's right, almost, There's not a particular theme to the letter, but that sort of encouragement, I think Fairfax must have been getting quite a lot. You need to be more decisive. We need to finish this. We need to sort something out. And Cromwell, he, from the last couple of years, say 1647, even Cromwell was making speeches in Parliament in favour of the king and an agreement. But there's definitely a shift in Cromwell's position. It's often given that the king's intransigence was the cause of that. But as I say, it is a very difficult one with Cromwell, I find, because you can read a letter from Cromwell, and he's either often not at the place where the pivotal place where everything's happening, but he has a network of people around him, and he couldn't have been in any shadow of doubt about some of these major events.
That's so interesting. I really do, that this guy that ends up grabbing the power is not involved somehow, yet he always seems to never be there. It's so interesting. So okay, the Rump Parliament passed a bill for a formation of a High Court of Justice because they could not get support from the House of Lords, could they? So explain that to us, please.
Yeah, so the ordinance for the King's trial is brought before Parliament. The House of Lords, I think even the House of Lords by that point is just a tiny attendance, but even they balk at what's been done. And probably they've heard what's been said at the Putney debates about the abolition of the House of Lords, the calls from the levellers. And perhaps they realise, most of them, that maybe things have gone too far, or, that their end is also going to come as well with the king. And they don't approve, and they decline the ordinance, but then they adjourn for holiday. So what happens is Parliament, the House of Commons, deal with the Lords the same way as they dealt with the king at the start of the conflict. when the king wouldn't play a ball, they declared that they were they could pass laws without the king's assent. And in effect, that's what they did to the lords. They decided, okay, if they're not going to play a ball, we are now the supreme authority in the land. We can pass laws without the lords. And they went ahead with the ordinance for the trial.
So this country is in an absolute mess at this stage, isn't it? If they can't, they've completely lost order, haven't they, really? If the Commons are deciding laws, then,
And the thing is here as well, it's not just the Commons, it is a rump of the Commons, appointed in effect or sanctioned by the army that's now controlling the kingdom. So in effect, the army does have that
nobody's
control.
been voted, they've been put there by the army.
Yeah, which is ironic when the Commons or the court say, we try you in the name of the people of England. Well, Lady Fairfax at one point shouted out, not a jot, it's not in the name of the people. Cromwell's a traitor. There was a genuine point to that. That you're talking about a rump of MPs who have brought the king to trial. They are not elected. As such, this is just, there might have been about 5 years before, but it's just a little segment of what's left, and that's certainly not representative of the people.
So the trial itself, so you start off with 3 judges and 150 commissioners, but only, when the trial begins, you only have 135 remaining. Is that through fear of reprisals from the royalists, maybe, or something along them sort of lines?
I think they just genuinely found that things had gone too far. I mean, you even have John Lilburne, the leader of the Levellers. Lilburne even stands up and says, look, what happened under the king's reign is nothing compared to what's happening now. And I think a lot of men felt that, things had gone way too far. As I say, the king was going to be on trial. That was unheard of. There was no legal basis. House of Lords had gone. Well, it hadn't gone at that point, but it had been bypassed. Got a rump parliament. You've got an army controlling things. The Scots are worried about what's going to happen to them after these independents win outright. Ireland's worried as well. The Catholics have always feared the Puritan majority in England's parliament. So yeah, there was a lot, I think, of concern about what would come afterwards. Perhaps genuine feeling that they'd gone too far. Yes, fear of reprisals. Perhaps fear that, like what the Earl of Manchester once said, if you can defeat the king 99 times or 90 times, but at the end of it, he's still king. So yeah, there's a lot of different concerns about how things are going.
Okay, so let's move on to the trial itself. So 2 of the main guys that are going to be involved in this are the Solicitor General John Cook, and we have the President of the Parliamentary Commission, John Bradshaw. So, but Bradshaw didn't choose by choice, did he? He sort of got thrust into that position, didn't he? So what is their role in this, and also what is Charles actually going to be charged for?
Okay, so Bradshaw. Bradshaw wasn't their first choice for Lord President of the court, but because the senior legal figures refused to take part, then naturally they were bound to find somebody as they went down the lower levels, and they found Bradshaw, who was Chief Justice of Chester and North Wales. John Cook was a lawyer, so he put the prosecution argument. I'd read that, ironically, that he was the one that established the right to silence in cases. Yet the court said that the court would actually put it to the king that silence was a sign of his guilt if he didn't plead. So yeah, Bradshaw, Cook. The king was charged with high treason. He was alleged to be guilty of all the treasons, murders, rapines, burnings, spoils, desolations, damages, and mischiefs. So they were quite comprehensive.
So basically, Parliament didn't do anything wrong. It's
well,
his fault.
Yeah, that's it. What I tend to see is like they basically wrapped it up in a bow and put it at Charles's door. and then that would close off everything that had happened to allow everybody to move forward. They list all of the battles that he was present at, as if to say that he's encouraged the war. It's ironic as well that later in the trial, when the session talk about witnesses, a lot of the witnesses give statements just that Charles was present at battles, or that he had a drawn sword, he wore a breastplate and backplate. But the parliamentarian cannons are opening up at the king at Edgehill, so he's not going to go there without any sort of armor. But I think what Parliament were probably aiming at was to not necessarily bring a whole host of witnesses to say that Charles ordered his troops to commit this atrocity, because Charles didn't order troops to commit atrocities. Yes, there was looting and things, but Charles was not personally involved. More so what they wanted to do was to prove Charles guilty because of the actions of his subordinates.
Okay, so again, so the trial had begun. It begins in Westminster Hall, which is still there today, which you can go and visit. I think you can, well, it depends what sort of day it is. Charles refused to enter a plea as he believed, obviously, in divine right of king, and only God could judge a king. So talk us through his plea hearing, because there's a story that I've read about where something to do with his cane or something like that.
Yeah, so this is on the first day, so the 20th of January, 1649. So as you say, there's 135 handpicked men that are there to try him. You've got 68 of them that turn up on the 20th. So the king is brought from St. James's Palace to Whitehall by water. So he's guarded with the soldiers in boats around him. 30 officers accompany him into the hall, and then the names of the commissioners are read out who were present, and that's when Sir Thomas Fairfax, or General Lord Fairfax, isn't present. Lady Fairfax is reputed to shout out, my husband has more wit than to be here. And just before Cook reads the charge, the king reaches over with his cane, which has a silver top, and taps Cook on the shoulder. He wants to say something. Cook ignores him. So the king taps again, and the silver head drops off the cane and rolls onto the floor. So the king at that point is standing up, looks at the head and makes no move, but nobody makes any move. The king expects that somebody would have picked that up. Nobody does. So in the end, he stoops and picks that up himself, which is one of the more well-known anecdotes of the trial, because it's almost symbolic, isn't it, that the king has had to stoop in front of his accusers and pick that up himself.
Well, can I just ask what the feeling is in the country at this point of knowing of this trial that's going on? Because obviously they would have known, wouldn't they? So what is the feeling in the, from the average Joe that, is, I know the country's split still, but like you said, the army's in control of all this. So what is their feeling on this?
I don't think that the entire country would know fully what was going on at that point. I mean, it did sometimes take quite a bit of time for news to travel, but obviously, like the key areas would know. I think on the one hand, there was a feeling that people maybe didn't dare speak out, because what would happen if they did? You've got both sides here, really, and if the king comes out of this and people have spoken up and supported it, then potentially that's their family marked, But equally, if they oppose the trial, you've got a very strong, victorious Rump and army
So
who knows what they
you
might do.
wouldn't say anything anyway because you'd be in trouble yourself. Yeah.
I think for the ordinary people, yeah, and certainly for leaders and MPs, there was there was opposition to the trial. The Scots themselves. So on that day, on the 22nd, actually, it was the 22nd of January, the Scots commissioners actually registered their opposition to the trial. And you did have, some people opposing it. But I think on the whole, people were thinking, well, what will happen? Will they be, surely they can't convict a king. Isn't it just show? Is this just to make him scared so that he agrees something? Will this lead to a settlement? I think people were I think it was very much open game. And I think people thought, well, actually, what's the plan here? How far might this go? And is it best to maybe speak my mind right now or see what happens?
Okay, so on the 27th of January, the king was found guilty of high treason and the death warrant is signed. Got a picture of the death warrant here, actually. I don't know whether that's original or not, but it's pretty cool. So obviously Oliver Cromwell's on there, but most of them on there. So this is signed by 59 of the commissioners, including Oliver Cromwell. So tell us a little bit more about, they move so quickly here, don't they? It goes from a guilty verdict to a couple of days later being executed, It moves so quickly, and is that their aim, just to get rid of him as quick as possible now because we've gone too far?
There's a lot of debate about it, as it stands today. So a lot of people say that it was a foregone conclusion that the king would be found guilty and executed. Others say that right up until the last moment, there was a chance that he might be either found not guilty or have a commuted sentence. But personally, I think that I think they were ready to do it. Yeah. So as you say, the document itself, people have studied the document, and there's again an argument that the document was signed in two parts, and that it was amended, and almost they didn't want to draw up a new document in case the people that had already signed it then refused to sign it again. So if you look at the document, so the word and sometimes doesn't make sense. It says on the morrow, and if that was signed, I think the 27th, that would mean the morrow would be the Sunday, which wouldn't happen. So yeah, a little bit of ambiguity about when it was drawn up. There's also some of these stories about how Cromwell forced one of the waverers to sign it, putting the quill into his hand, which I think that story came out at the trial of the regicides in 1660. Yeah. So a little bit iffy about whether that's right, but certainly, Cromwell was again, there apparently flicking ink at the commissioners, and playing a few pranks.
And again, that's a podcast for another day, because that's another interesting. The regicide trials and that is very interesting. But so obviously he's going to be executed. There's no two ways about it. And Charles has an emotional farewell to his younger children, doesn't he? Before a couple of days before, is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. So Princess Elizabeth, she's 14. Prince Henry's 9. They're the two children who had been held in London throughout the war. So Charles had only just seen them after his defeat. So he met the two children for the last time. So Elizabeth is in floods of tears. I think young Henry is slightly too young to understand exactly what's going on. So King raises them up from off their knees. And Elizabeth wrote down afterwards an account of what the king had said, and what she recalled was, he wished me not to grieve, not to torment myself for him, that he would be a glorious death, that he should die, it being for the laws and liberties of this land, and for maintaining the true Protestant religion. He told me that he had forgiven all his enemies and hoped God would forgive them also, and commanded us and the rest of my brothers and sisters to forgive them. Charles also told Elizabeth to pass the message to her mother, that his thoughts had never strayed from her, that their love would be the same to the last, He commanded the children to be obedient to Henrietta Maria, and bid Elizabeth send blessings to the rest of the brothers and sisters and commend Charles to all of his friends. At that point as well, so the king takes young Henry on his knee and says, "Sweetheart, now they will cut off thy father's head. Mark, child, what I say, they will cut off my head and perhaps make thee a king. But mark what I say, you must not be a king so long as your brothers Charles and James do live. For they will cut off your brothers' heads when they can catch them, and then cut off thy head too at the last." So quite a, warning. And actually, Charles was on the money there, because Parliament at one point do consider that there is debate about whether to make Henry, Duke of Gloucester, king afterwards. The boy actually replies, "I'll be torn to pieces first," and apparently that brought tears to the king's eyes. The king then dishes out the last of his jewels, so broken jewels of the Order of the Garter, things like that. Not much. Kisses them both, takes his leave. Elizabeth then, very harrowing. So Elizabeth breaks down again. The king goes back to her, embraces her, and then he leaves the children and returns to prayer. But at that point, the king's legs actually give way, and that's documented even from the Venetian ambassador as well. So I think it was extremely draining for Charles, very upsetting, and I think it took him quite a lot to recover and come back from that. So much so that he refused to see anyone else after that.
Okay, so we get to the 30th. The execution takes place at the Banqueting House in Whitehall, London, which is a royal palace, isn't it? So please talk us through the events of the day. So I have got a picture of the Banqueting House, and there is a plaque which I really annoyingly walked past in November. I didn't realise it was there. So talk us through the day, please.
Yep. So on the morning, the king wakes up very early, the 30th, Tuesday the 30th, at St. James's Palace. So he enters some prayer and devotion. He's accompanied by the former Bishop of London, because Parliament have abolished episcopacy. So the Bishop of London, William Juxon, and one other man, Thomas Herbert. So Herbert's appointed by Parliament to basically spy on Charles, and so they dismiss Charles as close servants and then install Herbert. But Herbert actually comes to sort of respect the king's stance. So with the bishop and with Herbert, Charles is escorted across St. James's Park by guards. There's guards lining the entire route. A couple of stories about the fact that the drumming that loud that nobody can be heard. Charles apparently then speaks some words to one of his captors, one of the officers with him, Colonel Tomlinson, and makes reference to his wishes for his funeral. They enter Whitehall Palace. They go through some of the galleries to the king's bedchamber, and there, that's where Charles is left, quite distressingly, for 4 hours without news. So at this point, William Juxon urges Charles to take some food and some wine. Initially, the king doesn't want to, but Juxon says, kind of the cold weather and everything, you really should, otherwise there's a risk that you might faint, and that would give the wrong impression. Other thing is that Charles has got 2 shirts on, which is another well-known fact or anecdote. So he wears 2 shirts to stop any shivering from the cold being mistaken as fear. There's a knock on the door. He has different men trying to prayer with him. So they're offering to pray with him. These are men that have often debated religion with him. He declines, sends them away. And then eventually, the Colonel Hacker arrives to take charge of Charles and escort him to the scaffold. There's a lot of debate about what happened in those hours. Why was there such a delay? Was it that Parliament had to rush through emergency legislation to make it illegal for Charles's son to be proclaimed as king on the king's death, because it was all instant as soon as the king died. Long live the king, the new king is proclaimed. Others say it's because they didn't have an executioner and they couldn't get one. So the state executioner, or the city executioner, Richard Brandon, had refused. And then there was a bit of a furore over trying to find replacements. So yeah, there's a couple of different options as to why. But at any rate, Charles is then escorted through under the Rubens ceiling of the banqueting house, and then out onto the scaffold.
Okay, so there is still a debate to this day, isn't there, of who was the executioner? And one story I read was that Hugh Peters was actually involved somewhere along the lines. I don't know whether that's true or not, but apparently obviously he wasn't a very liked man, was he, Hugh Peters? But
no,
he is seen at the beginning or around about the execution, and then all of a sudden he disappears when the execution's taking place and then reappears again. Whether he's the one that held the head up, people are not too sure about. But yeah, I read that yesterday and I just wanted to talk about that. But yeah, but again, nobody actually really knew who dropped the axe, did they?
That's right, yeah. So the headsman and his assistant. So there's a number of people on the scaffold, actually. You've got army officers, you've got Juxon himself. Herbert stays back in the banqueting house. He's too distressed. You've got the executioner's assistant, but then also scribes, recording Charles's words. And the executioner assistant are both disguised. So there's a lot of descriptions used. Some say that they were wearing sailors' clothes. Others that he had a grey beard. The executioner had a grey beard and was referred to as old greybeard. Wigs. The assistant supposedly had a cocked hat. But yeah, so they were disguised. Nobody knew who they were. Peters, I have heard the Hugh Peters one. I think that stems a lot from the fact that when the king's head was cut off, the assistant held the head up but remained silent. And the argument there is that everybody would have recognized Hugh Peters' voice because he was an army chaplain. He preached a lot of sermons to a lot of people. So people, I think that was the trail of thought there, that the man stayed silent. But, there could have been numerous reasons for why there was silence. It could be that the assistant just wasn't familiar with protocol, or it could be that they just, maybe just decided not to, so.
Okay, so I understand that the king did give a little speech, but because the crowd was so far back, they couldn't hear it. But people on the scaffold would have done. So, do you know anything about the speech that he made?
Yeah, so as you say, the king knew that he wouldn't be heard by people down below, the people held back by the soldiers, but he knew that speech would make its way out, and there were scribes there, as I say. So the king, in a nutshell, it's quite a long speech. There's a lot of discussion that, with Juxon as well. Juxon offers reminders to the king. So the king basically says that it's my duty to God first and to my country to clear himself as an honest man, a good king and a good Christian. So he almost starts to set out a little bit of his position. He says that he never did begin a war with the two houses of Parliament. He never did intend to encroach upon their privileges. He says that they began upon him by demanding the militia, control of the militia from him. He tells people, take a look at the dates of the commissions. you'll see that they began it, not I. He does say that he doesn't tar everybody with the same brush, and that there was some what he called ill instruments between Parliament and him that were the chief cause. But he says, yet for all that, God forbid that I should be so ill a Christian as not to say that God's judgments are just upon me. And this is quite crucial. So what the king says at this point is, many times he does pay justice by an unjust sentence. And he says, I will only say this, that an unjust sentence that I suffered for to take effect is punished now by an unjust sentence on me. Now, the king's referring to the Earl of Strafford with that. And Parliament had clamoured before the war for the execution of Strafford. And the king had really misjudged the situation by declaring publicly his support for Strafford. So in effect, Parliament then proceeded by an act of attainder. And sorry to go off the topic here, but the only reason I'm explaining this is because this becomes quite crucial to why Charles or Charles' psyche and what he's thinking at this time. Charles never forgave himself for signing the death warrant of Strafford. He was under duress again because the House of Commons voted in favour of Strafford's death. Charles went to the House of Lords and pleaded for Strafford's life, but made the mistake of saying, look, whatever happens, I'm not going to sign that document. So the House of Lords felt, okay, well, we'll pass it in that case because the king's not going to sign it, So why would the House of Lords make a stand at a point when mobs were marauding around the city when the king wasn't going to sign anyway? So the king was then boxed into a corner. Mobs, storm the palace at Whitehall, protesting. And in the end, for the safety of his family, he agrees, but never forgives himself. And as he says there, he really does believe that God has brought this sentence upon him.
Yeah. Okay. So he basically blames himself then. Yeah.
Yeah.
Really interesting view. Yeah, I like that. Yeah. Okay. So he does. Sorry, carry on.
I was just going to say there's a few more little bits and pieces. So he then goes on to say that he's forgiven all the world. Forgiven those that are the chief causes of his death. He prays that this is not laid to their charge. But then he does go on, and I think you made reference to it actually in some of the notes, that he makes a speech about government and says, you will never do right, nor God will never prosper until you give God his due, the king his due, and he says, by that, my successors, and the people their due. And he says, I am as much for the people as any of you. You must give God his due. But then he says, for the people, I truly desire their liberty and freedom as much as anybody whomsoever. But I must tell you that their liberty and their freedom consists in having government, those laws by which their life and goods must be their own. It is not for having a share in government. And I think that's, clear. The king doesn't believe in the leveller cause, doesn't support that. Neither do the army grandees, Fairfax, Cromwell and Ireton. But he's making that clear. A subject and a sovereign are clean different things. He then says, if he had given way to an arbitrary power and had all of the laws changed according to the power of the sword, then he need not have come here. So basically what Charles says, and he actually says this himself, is, I am the martyr of the people. In the current situation with the Rump Parliament and army, no House of Lords, complete change to the fundamental laws of the kingdom, he is the one that's standing up now for those ancient laws. Juxon then just reminds him, maybe speak something about your religion. And he says, his conscience in religion is very, very well known to the world. But he says he dies a Christian according to the profession of the Church of England, as I found it left by my father.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for sharing that. That was cool. So can I just ask, so he obviously gets executed, his head is severed from his body, and a lot of people faint in the crowd, obviously, because seeing that was probably horrendous. But does this send a shockwave around Europe that Britain or England has executed their own king?
I think it does, yeah. And you mentioned earlier, was it a bit of a rush job? And I think actually there was a little bit of a rush at the end because, as I said, the Scots commissioners had declared categorically their opposition to the execution. The French were sending emissaries, but also the Dutch states had sent over envoys, and they were in London at that moment. Actually, the day before the execution and the day of the execution, they were meeting with General Fairfax. Fairfax seems to be trying to go for a stay of execution. So the Dutch envoys say that Fairfax promises to go to Parliament and put before them a request for a stay of execution. But yeah, it moves faster than Fairfax and the envoys. And I think they are very shocked. Yeah, they're shocked that it's gone ahead. A lot of people are savvy, so I think many had already begun to ingratiate themselves with the parliamentarians. But I think the shock was the manner of the king's death. So it was done so publicly. It was decisively done. And I think that almost shocked a lot of people into accepting, that it's happened. And the new government, don't go up against them, really. Look what they've done.
And again, it doesn't end the war, does it? Because it carries on till 1651. So, you know, it doesn't end anything, does it?
That's it. I mean, there's a large groan in the crowd, which William Dugdale, referred to in his writing. He was present. He said there was a large groan that he never wanted to hear the like of again. People, again, Charles wasn't the first king to believe in divine right, not at all. But I think, again, what isn't often said is that a lot of his people did believe that by executing the God's anointed king, that the country would have a lot of miseries, brought down on it.
Okay. So, Mark, you have authored 3 books so far, and you are working on another one, what you said to me on the phone a couple of weeks ago. So tell us a little bit about your books, please, mate, because, I haven't read them yet, but I do plan on getting a couple of copies and reading them. So tell us about your books, please.
Well, so the first one, Allegiance of Blood, so that was a novel, a full novel that I'd self-published. That was the first book that I'd written. I mean, I've always been passionately interested in the Civil War since I first found out about it when I was 10, and I've always wanted to write a book. And Allegiance of Blood was the culmination of that. So it opens after the Battle of Edgehill and closes at Alton in 1643, December 43. That follows a fictional character through those events. But there's also historical characters through all 3 books. The other 2, so The King's Spy and The King's Captain, they are novellas, so shorter books. Same character, Allegiance of Blood is one character. The King's Spy, The King's Captain are a different character. And the third book that you mentioned is the third in the series of the Rebellion series.
Okay.
Book 3. So that is
a lot of work goes into, because obviously, like you said, you've got a fictional character, but you're basing it around actual events, aren't you? So there must be a lot of work that goes into making sure you get this stuff correct. Is that right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, with fiction, there's always that argument that, well, you can use a bit of artistic license. I don't like to. It seems to work well that sort of my fictional characters, what happens to them sort of weaves into the chronology of the history quite well, and I like to keep that chronology accurate. You know, there's only once that I'd bent the truth slightly, which I, you know, put in the forward of the King's Spy. But the King's Spy and the King's Captain, they are dealing with Naseby, so the end of the war. So Allegiance of Blood is more the start. The King's Spy is 1645 to 46. King's Captain 1645 to 46 to Charles's escape from Oxford, which we covered earlier. Book 3 is going to be precisely what we've just talked about as well, about Carys Brook.
So Mark has also got a really good Facebook page, guys, and what I will do is put links to his books, to his Facebook page, and everything up on the description below. Mark, I really enjoyed this. This is something I've been, since I started my page nearly 12 months ago, wanting to talk about for a long time, because I do like the American Civil War, but the English Civil War is a very close run thing with the American Civil War. And I honestly, mate, you've been absolutely brilliant, and I really do hope that we can do this again at some point.
Yeah, I'd love to. I mean, hopefully, you know, hopefully that was exactly what you wanted. And
it was definitely, it was amazing, mate. Honestly, I really enjoyed it, and I mean, I've learned a lot tonight by just listening to you telling the story. So thanks again, Mark, and cheers.
Yeah, no problem. Thoroughly enjoyed it. Thanks, Darren. Thanks for talking to us.